Hello, welcome to the ILC Daily Show. My name is Martin Murphy.
And I'm Salwa Kanana.
Welcome back, and Salwa, it's great to have you back in the show. Our colleague Sophie is with the News and Media team this morning, but we have plenty for you in this show. We just heard from three high-level guests this morning because we went back to the high-level visits. We had the King Leslie III from Lesotho. We also had the President of Colombia, Iván Duque Marquez, and we also heard from the first Vice President of Cuba, Salvador Antonio Valdés Mesa. In this show, we're going to have some more live interviews as we've been doing throughout this week and last week. We're going to be talking about indigenous people's rights and also on the issue of gender equality. Remember, we're live on the ILO website, but also on Facebook and Twitter. So if you want to start sending in your questions already on the issues of indigenous people's rights and gender equality, please do so. The hashtag is ILO100 or OIT100 in French and Spanish. But before we move any further, let's see what's been happening so far. So Salwa, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Martin. Indeed, as you mentioned, the high-level visits resumed this morning at the International Labour Conference. As you mentioned, King Letsie of Lesotho, the President of Colombia, the Vice President of Cuba. We have heard from those who addressed delegates at the plenary this morning. And this afternoon, we're also expecting to welcome the Prime Minister of Portugal, Antonio Costa, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Amor Motley, and the Vice President of Costa Rica, Marvin Rodriguez Cordera. And we just should mention that yesterday afternoon, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Roberto Acevedo, also participated in the second-to-last thematic forum for this year's ILC on multilateralism for an equitable future of work.
Yes, so like Salwa was mentioning, yesterday we had the last two of the thematic forums. The one that took place in the morning was on the issue of multilateralism for an equitable future. And if you want to catch any of those thematic forums, you can go to the ILO website and watch any one of those seven. So that they're all archived there. Now, after the panel on multilateralism, our colleagues who are working with us on the ILC show had a chance to talk to two of the panelists in that forum. The first one was Ms. Sharon Barrow, who's the Secretary General of the ITUC, and the second one is Gabriela Ramos, who's the OECD Sherpa and to the G20 and also the Chief of Staff at the OECD. Let's take a look.
I'm here with Sharon Burrow, who's the Secretary General of the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, and we've just come out of a thematic forum on multilateralism and the future of work and looking at inequalities and how we can reduce those inequalities in the world of work. Sharon, what was your main message to the forum today?
The global model of economy is broken. We need a new economic model, and it must be founded on the original intent of the multilateral system. If you go back to the dark days of the last century, the ILO was formed with the intent of repairing the social and economic damage that had been done by World War I, and then, of course, the Philadelphia Declaration. So social justice, a floor of global rights, minimum living wages. These issues were the commitment of governments, of workers, and indeed of employers in the ILO. And more broadly, they were reflected in the mandate of the other multilateral institutions, Bretton Woods, the WTO, and others. And yet, when you look at the outcome, people have forgotten that mandate outside of the ILO, which sits sadly in a silo where social dialogue does work. It's painful and it's dreadfully slow sometimes, but it works. However, because of the other silos, so labour, trade, finance and environment all walk on separate legs, then the world of work is in dire trouble, because the quest for profit at any cost means that we have 60% of the global workforce now in informal work. And that's being swelled by the ranks of the new platform businesses. Now, we know how to clean it up. We need that universal labour guarantee. We need a floor of social rights. We need minimum living wages and collective bargaining to share prosperity and enable people to live with dignity. And we need to actually revisit working time in the age of technology so people have some control over their lives and therefore prevent the escalation of mental health, the breakdown in families and other social areas of despair. We also need skills and universal social protection, so public education and lifelong learning, critical for everybody. But unless the multilateral system is coherent around the acceptance of these goals, and then governments have the political will to reinforce rights and compliance, then we are going to see the age of anger we're living in simply escalate, and the social despair becomes conflictual, and we're already seeing increase in conflict and the highest level of displacement of people everywhere. So repairing the social contract, renewing it for the next century, which is about the disruptions of climate and technology and the just transitions we need, and ensuring that universal social protection and minimum living wages are the base of people's being able to have that notion of the dignity of work where labour is not a commodity. That's the challenge.
Are you seeing the conversation on inequalities? Because we're seeing the gap widening and widening and widening, and we're seeing the concentration of wealth in ever less hands. Are you seeing the conversation changing at the moment when there are discussions about inequality?
There's no doubt that inequality is now recognised as a global risk, and that's across the system. And I don't think you heard anybody deny that in the panel today. However, actually getting that action plan that one of the audience members called for is still elusive. We want to see a new declaration that sets the ILO up to be not just a robust organisation to frame the dignity of work in terms of a regulatory environment, global floor of rights, shared prosperity through collective bargaining, minimum wages, and of course universal social protection, but to be able to sit the ILO at the centre of coherence of the way the global economy works. We also want to be able to see that this is not just for the developed world, because that promise of the social contract, which did deliver for the developed world up until the 1980s, when we saw a machete taken to the social contract by the growth of multinationals, the growth of oligopsonies, and the denial of rights through supply chains, a terribly abusive model of trade. Dehumanising. Our supply chains are dehumanising exploitation. There's no other way to describe it. But if we don't actually then repair that, but move forward to say, what are the just transitions? How do we find human-centred approaches to technology and climate challenges? Then we will be even deeper in despair. So the declaration here is absolutely critical to set the ILO up, but it's critical to place the ILO at the centre of coherence. And you heard today the innovation of a tripartite declaration in the G7, the demand for coherence where governments, workers and employers work together to reduce inequalities, yes, but to set prosperity up for an inclusive future and one that works for both working people and their families, for the planet and for business.
Thank you very much, Sharon Burrow.
Thank you.
We have just finished a session on multilateralism for a more equitable future of work. Gabriela Ramos, OECD Chief of Staff and one of the Sherpas to the G20, was part of the panelists. I would like to know, what was your main message to the session today?
The main message is that inequalities of income, of wealth, of opportunities are reaching extremely high levels. We know that with the current growth model, 40% of the population had been their wages stagnant, had been their opportunities stagnant, and the top of the income distribution is really concentrating a large benefit of growth. So we know that this growth model that created this distribution of income and opportunities has also had a great impact on the environment. We did not touch it there, but the fact is that what the OECD is saying is that we really need to change, we think, about economic growth. We really need to rethink the model, and we need to put people at the center. And what I mean for that is to look at how the policies that we all take on the fiscal, on the monetary, on the social policies, on the employment issues are going to benefit people, children, women, workers, and more than anything, focusing on those that are at the bottom of the income distribution. That's what we call people-centered growth, and I think that's what we really need.
It was a very interesting discussion inside the session. A lot of people wanting to, say what they think about the future of society, really. Is there a solution? Can we really fight inequality? What are the main obstacles we are facing?
Well, the main obstacles is the political economy. If you have the top 10% of the population having 40% or holding 40% of the wealth, if you have them having much more access to the decision-making process, because of course they have more influence, the kind of radical changes that we need to see in that distribution of the benefits of growth, but also the changes that we need to do to achieve a low-carbon economy are going to be very difficult because we're talking about winners and losers. The whole point that what we're trying to do at the OECD is to try to reframe this discussion, because it's not about winners or losers. It's about the fact that this growth model is even not good for growth. We're losing growth. Why? Because you're not investing in the skills of these low-income families. You are not allowing for companies to thrive, because in the context of the digital world, there is a high concentration in the fact that many companies, big companies and big platforms, are really having a very large share of the markets. And therefore, the question is, how do we change this narrative in a way that everybody sees that we will benefit more in terms of not only having higher rates of productivity and growth if we empower and allow the bottom of the income distribution to fulfill their full potential, but also that is the only way to make this sustainable and to make this work for everybody. And to help us, Luis, to do and to recover something that has been lost in the last decade with the results that we have been having, which is trust. Trust in the institutions, trust in multilateralism, trust in democracy. This is very dangerous, and we really need to look at those issues to rebuild confidence and to go for a growth model that delivers for people.
And what about multilateralism?
Well, the fact is that we have gone we have been for decades integrating ourselves, integrating markets, integrating investment flows, integrating trade. So we are now very, very linked. All the countries are very linked. Trade conflicts are difficult because they don't see all the interlinkages that we have on investments, on production processes, on global value chains. So if the solutions are global, for migration, for climate, for trade, there's no other way than the multilateral way. And the fact is that the solutions are enhanced if all the countries feel they are really participating. We are doing it at the OECD with the work that we are advancing on taxation, avoiding tax evasion and tax erosion. This needs a common solution, because if every country is going to go and tax digital, for example, by their own, then we will finish with suboptimal outcomes. So we really need multilateral institutions. But we need countries also to support those multilateral solutions, to address questions of migration, to address questions of climate change, to address questions of inequality, to address questions of all the people that, as I said, have been left behind, to advance gender equality. All these areas, of course, can be addressed by good policies at the domestic level, and we know what policies are there. But there is also the fact that we have international institutions that have international standards. The OECD has the due diligence guidance for supply chains to avoid child slavery, for example, partnering with Kailash Satyarthi to avoid that. Or we have anti-bribery convention. We know that the United Nations have the UNCA, which is a very encompassing instrument. The WTO has rules. The ILO has social justice standards. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to make these institutions count and allow them to deliver, to then make the common people in the streets, those that are really not happy with the ways the thing is going, to believe that the multilateral system can deliver for them.
Thank you very much for your time.
That video that we just saw was an interview with panelists on yesterday's thematic forum. The ITUC's Sharon Burrow and OECD's Gabriela Ramos. Now, as we've been doing throughout the Daily Show, we've been bringing you highlights from our global celebration, which took place on the 11th of April to celebrate the ILO's 100th anniversary. Today, we are going to, and this, of course, was 24 events taking place over a full 24 hours. Today, we're going to be bringing you highlights from Salvador with the Brazilian artists Daniela Mercury and a performance of tango as well from Buenos Aires.
Obrigada, diretor da OIT, Brasil, Martim, diretor-geral, Guy Ryder, Thaís Dimé, Sônia Levi, e eu quero mandar beijo especial para Elisa Lucinda. Obrigada. Thank you for everyone. Congratulations to all members to this 100th anniversary of International Labour Organization. A Organização Internacional do Trabalho, a Organização Internacional do Trabalho. Gracias, obrigada. Thank you. Brasil! A cor dessa cidade, o canto dessa cidade, a cor dessa cidade, o canto dessa cidade. Salve o Brasil, a Bahia. Beijo, kisses to everyone in the world. O gueto, a rua, fé. Eu vou andando a pé pela cidade bonita, o toque do foché e a força de onde vem ninguém explica, porque Salvador, o que é tua fé. Eu vou andando a pé pela cidade bonita, o toque do foché e a força de onde vem ninguém explica. Brasil, ela é bonita. Brasil. Beijo. Argentina. Now is you welcome to this party. Todas las voces, todas las manos, toda la sangre puede ser canción en el viento. Canta conmigo, canta. Gracias, hermano americano. Argentina. Now is you. Continue this wonderful party in the world. Gracias, obrigada. Obrigada, Brasil. Dos filhos deste solo és mãe, gentil, pátria amada, Brasil.
Welcome back. Those were the events that took place in Salvador, Brazil, and Buenos Aires in Argentina as part of the ILO's global tour, which was the 24-hour event that we held on April 11th. Remember, if you want to watch more of those events, you can go on the ILO website and pick the one that you want to look at, or if you want, you can watch the 24 hours of the whole event. Now, let's talk about the issue of income inequality. Income inequality, it's something which is exactly the opposite of social justice. It's a great social injustice. And it's something that unfortunately has been growing over the past decades. To know more about this issue, our colleague Adam Bowers caught up recently with the ILO's wage specialist, Patrick Velter, to ask him a little bit about income inequality and especially wage inequality. Let's take a look.
I'm joined today by senior ILO economist and wages expert Patrick Belser. Patrick, hello.
Hello.
We're here to talk about wages and inequality in general. Now, the ILO puts out a global wage report every couple of years, and a year ago we were talking about low wage growth in 2017. In fact, a record low growth since the 2008 crisis. But wages have recovered slightly in some countries since then. What are you seeing in terms of trends now, and what does it mean for the global economy?
Well, it's true that in 2017, what we saw was very flat wages. So in spite of a good economic performance, we had actually global wage growth not exceeding 2%, and that was really low. Now, if you remove China from the equation, we were at 1.1%. So that was very disappointing. Now we're seeing a bit of an uptick. We're seeing some good news in the US, in the UK, but how substantial this really is in terms of numbers, we're not so sure yet. I think we're seeing a moderate increase in wages, nothing really very spectacular at the moment, and still a situation where people are asking why wages are not increasing more in light of the economic recovery and the downward trend in unemployment. And normally when you have such a situation, you would expect to have much more rapid wage growth, but we're not really seeing it at the moment.
So GDP growth still outstrips wage growth around the world. I mean, you mentioned some differences between countries, but is there big regional disparities? Are we seeing a sort of alignment of GDP and wage growth in some areas?
It's true, we see big differences across regions. So when you look at the situation in advanced economies in Europe, in 2017-18, we had wage growth that was close to zero, to be honest. You have some countries where wages are still lower than they were in 2008. So you really have a situation of completely flat average wages. Now, if you look at Asia, the situation is different. Asia is a dynamic region. It has strong wage growth. In China, there has been average wage growth of 8% a year for the last 10 years. It means that average wages have doubled over a 10-year period, which is quite spectacular when you think in terms of the impact it has on the improvement of the quality of life of people. And of course, China is a bit of an exceptional case, but you have other countries in Asia that are growing really rapidly in terms of wages. You have Vietnam, you have a number of other countries. So in Asia in general, over the last 10 years, I would say that average wages have increased by close to 50%, which is a huge improvement in the quality of life. Now you have other regions where the situation has been dynamic, but much less so. So we've done a major effort to collect data on wages in Africa, and we've seen that wages there have increased maybe on average 15% over the last 10 years. It's good. It's not as dynamic as Asia. And then in Latin America, we have a situation with much more moderate wage growth. So a lot of disparity across regions, but also a lot of disparity across countries within regions. And definitely also a situation where some of the emerging economies are catching up with some of the richer countries.
So I mean, you talked about Asia there, and there's a clear, it seems, correlation between reductions in poverty and increasing wages. I mean, across the board, is this the key? I mean, if we address wage policy, will that help to reduce inequalities, to reduce poverty?
It's a very important component to reduce inequality and reduce poverty, yes. We've done a global wage report on that issue, looking at the link between wages and overall income inequality. And what we found is that really two things stand out over the last few years when you look at inequality trends. One is the creation of jobs that are providing a stable source of income for people, so paid employment jobs with decent pay. And on the other hand, what is happening to wage inequality. And when you get this combination right of creating jobs and having the institutions in place and the policies in place to reduce wage inequality, then you can succeed in reducing overall income inequalities. We've seen examples of this working in a number of countries in Latin America. Brazil has been an example. And so it's very important. It's very important also to have a wage floor. So we work a lot on minimum wages with countries. We see a big trend towards establishment or strengthening of minimum wages, and having a good, adequate minimum wage in place, I think, is also something which makes a huge difference to millions of people.
And we know that reductions in poverty, reductions in inequality sort of increase social cohesion. You know, we've seen in recent years social discord, if you want to put it that way, and turning towards sort of populist measures to find solutions. But for you, I mean, what is the policy choice that needs to be made?
Well, first of all, yes, as you say, it's. I think high inequalities have many different adverse consequences. So you have consequences on the social cohesion, on many countries actually trying to reduce inequality in order to promote social harmony or harmonious societies, and so that's a very important social factor. There is also adverse consequences on the economy. When your inequality is too high, you don't have a growing middle class, you have constraints on the demand for the goods and services that are produced in the economy, and so you have also negative economic consequences. And then you have sometimes the surprising political consequences of high inequality, with people experiencing frustration, people have a sense that the fruits of progress are not being distributed in a fair way, and they will turn to some alternative political options that are on the table.
And something you said there, the IMF has been saying in recent years, you know, inequality is a drag on economic growth. And we'll be talking to Christine Lagarde during the conference on this issue probably. I mean, is the ILO sort of working with the IMF on research on this area?
That's it's an interesting point you're making, because I think what you really see over the last few years is that most of the international organizations and the IFIs, international financial institutions, have now picked up on this issue of inequality. They've realized that too much inequality is a really bad thing, and so you have the World Bank, you have the OECD, you have the IMF working on this issue. So we've had a number of exchanges with them. We have invited the IMF to the ILO. The ILO has been invited to the IMF. We have exchanged views. We're exchanging data. We've been working also together on the issue of the decline of the part of GDP that goes into labor compensation. That's the so-called labor income share. And so we're having some good exchanges at that level.
Okay, well, one of the areas we're seeing a lot of international cooperation partnership is the issue of gender inequality. And so we have the Equal Pay International Coalition now looking particularly at the gender pay gap. Now, the Global Wage Report last year looked at the gender pay gap in quite a lot of detail. Could you give us an idea of the main findings?
Yes, absolutely. We had this focus in our last Global Wage Report on the gender pay gap, and so we started by collecting data and looking at how big the gender pay gap is at global level. And we found that there's different ways of measuring the gender pay gap. There's hourly, monthly, there's different measures that can be used, but roughly speaking, women earn 20% less than men on average in the world. And so it remains a frustrating experience for women. There is also a lot of consensus now that the progress has not been fast enough over the last few years, and there is, I think, a real set of initiatives that try and accelerate the progress in this area. You've mentioned the Equal Pay International Coalition. There have been a number of initiatives at the ILO and in many other places as well. And so what we've been trying to do is to look at what causes this 20% gender pay gap. And one of the strong findings is that it is not differences in the levels of education between men and women. In the labor market, among those people who have wage jobs, paid jobs, women are often more highly educated than men. So this is not an excuse anymore. We really have to turn to other solutions and to other policy areas as well. Not saying that inequality in access to education has been achieved in the world, but when you look at the labor market, what explains the gender pay gap, you see that two things stand out. First of all, that there is a motherhood pay gap. So when women become mothers, their wages tend to be reduced for a variety of reasons, because they have interruptions in the labor market, because they decide to change jobs, sometimes because the enterprise doesn't offer flexibility in terms of hours, and so there's a penalty attached to that. And secondly, there is also discrimination. I think we have to look at this in much more detail now. Countries need to have equal pay legislation, so guaranteeing equal pay for work of equal value. And some initiatives have been taken now to increase the transparency also of the wages at enterprise levels and making this information more widely available. So I think one finding was wages are lower in enterprises and in sectors where the proportion of women are higher, and there's no reason for that to be the case. And so this clearly points to a situation of discrimination.
Patrick Belser, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was Adam Bowers speaking to the ILO's wage specialist, Patrick Belser, about how to address income inequality. Now, in a few moments, we're going to have our first live guest here with us in the studio, and that's going to be Martin Oltz, who is the ILO's senior specialist on equality and non-discrimination and an expert on Indigenous people's rights. A reminder that we're live on ILO.org on the website, as well as on the ILO Twitter. So if you do have any questions on Indigenous people's rights, please do send them in via social media, and your hashtag is ILO 100, or in French and Spanish, OIT 100. Before we speak to Martin, here is a short animation video explaining how the ILO works to improve decent work opportunities for Indigenous peoples.
There are more than 370 million women and men all over the world who belong to an indigenous and tribal people. Their traditions and ways of life often puts them at odds with the wider population, drawing social, economic, cultural, and political lines through society. Indigenous and tribal peoples have suffered because of this in the past. Many have been forced away from their lands and territories they have traditionally occupied, leading to loss of livelihoods, culture, and identity. A number of countries have started to take steps to right these wrongs. Yet, Indigenous and tribal peoples continue to be among the most disadvantaged. As a result, while only 5% of the world's population, Indigenous peoples account for nearly 15% of the world's poor. Their voices and own vision of development tend to be overlooked, while they now face new threats from the impacts of climate change. Critically, Indigenous women and men find it more difficult to access decent jobs due to discrimination and lack of access to quality education and training. Their traditional occupations and knowledge are frequently not recognized, despite these being fundamental tools for the fight against climate change. But if Indigenous and tribal peoples continue to be left behind, the goal of ending poverty cannot be reached, and action to tackle climate change will remain incomplete. Indigenous peoples care for an estimated 22% of the Earth's surface and protect nearly 80% of remaining biodiversity on the planet. For example, a recent study in Brazil showed that deforestation in areas managed by indigenous communities with protected rights was less than 1%, compared to 7% deforestation in other areas. In 2015, through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, the international community embarked on a historic mission to empower people, strengthen dialogue, and spur green growth for inclusive and sustainable development. To achieve this, harnessing the contributions of indigenous and tribal peoples is essential. The International Labour Organization, which hosts the only international treaty open for ratification on the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples, ILO Convention No. 169, has a new game plan to do just this. By making sure their rights are respected, their voices are heard, their livelihoods are secured, and their working conditions and social protection are improved. By ensuring that development empowers indigenous women and embraces gender equality. By closing knowledge gaps and by strengthening partnerships, bringing together governments, trade unions, employers in the private sector, civil society, the United Nations, and more importantly, indigenous and tribal peoples themselves. Investing in people and communities, striving for rights-based development, and ensuring decent work for all are fundamental for solving our global problems. Together, let's make sure that indigenous and tribal peoples are not left behind, and that they too can play their role as agents of change in a united effort to build a sustainable, inclusive, and peaceful planet.
That was a short animation showing how the ILO works to promote the rights of indigenous peoples around the world. We're going to talk about that issue right now, and I wanted to ask you to keep sending your questions and messages. This one came in from Susana Pack. It's actually on the question of rising inequality and income inequality that we saw before. She says, education is the best way to tackle rising inequality. Agree? Well, yes, I have to agree with that. So please continue sending your questions, especially now if you have any questions about indigenous people's rights. With us is Martin Elt, our senior specialist on equality and non-discrimination, and also the ILO expert on the issue of indigenous people's rights. Martin, welcome to the show. Great to have you with us. The ILO has been working on the issue of indigenous and tribal people's rights since the 1920s. And in fact, this year, if I'm not mistaken, it's the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of Indigenous and Tribal People, Convention 169. Can you tell us a bit more about the importance of this convention?
You're absolutely right. We are celebrating this year the 30 years of this important convention. It was actually the culmination of long-standing work in the ILO, but it's still the only international treaty that specifically protects the rights of indigenous peoples. And so the ILO is responsible for this convention and works with the UN system to promote the rights of indigenous peoples. It's an instrument that fits very well in the ILO, despite it's not being one of our typical labor conventions, because it deals about issues that affect the lives of indigenous peoples and the lives of countries. It speaks about participation, about consultation with indigenous peoples, about land rights, and also promoting respect for the diversity and the cultures of indigenous people. So it has played really an important role in the life of countries, and the ILO is proud to be responsible and to support ILO constituents and indigenous peoples themselves in realizing the objectives of this important instrument.
And when you mentioned that it's made a huge difference in the lives of the people in certain countries, I know, for example, in Guatemala, that played a key role, this convention, in Nepal, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, over the years, actually, the convention has been used in a number of countries that had to deal with difficult situations of civil wars, of situations where tensions between population groups led to armed conflict. And so many of these situations were actually rooted in the inequality, in long-standing and historic injustices that indigenous peoples were facing. And so the convention was actually seen as a tool to make peace. And this is really also very important to note. At the centenary session of the International Labour Conference, our organization is about building peace through social justice, and we can see the instrument also in that sense. So in Guatemala, the convention, as you mentioned, became part of the peace accords, and the ILO ILO is working on the ground also now to help the country, the constituents, to put in place the laws and the measures and programs that are required to give full effect to the convention, because obviously implementing this convention in full is an ongoing process that is there for any country that has ratified it, and also for countries that are looking into ratification right now.
Martin, could you maybe give us an overview of the inequalities, the range of inequalities that affect indigenous peoples?
Yes. Indigenous peoples face a range of situations. We also have to say that their situations are different within a country, between countries. It's because they are themselves different. They have different ethnicities, different cultures, different priorities, different ways of living. But in general, they share a history of exclusion and discrimination. That means that they live often at the margins of society with less access to public services. And when we are talking about access to employment and decent work, it means also that they are more often in the informal economy where labor rights violations are more frequent. And hence we have addressed the situation of indigenous peoples also through our work to combat child labor and forced labor. If we look at data where it exists, we see that indigenous peoples consistently have less access to formal employment, to quality jobs, and they may also face less support when it comes to promoting livelihoods, sustainable livelihoods. So, and this is actually where the ILO has a great opportunity to be of assistance to countries in addressing these inequalities, which are consistent and persistent despite the fact over the last 2 decades some countries have made actually also some progress in closing the poverty gap affecting indigenous peoples.
Now you just gave us a good overview there, but indigenous peoples in fact count for 5% of the world's population. However, they count for 15% of the world's poor. Can you just go into a bit more detail on why access to decent jobs is more difficult for these populations?
One of the difficulties is, of course, that many of them live in rural areas where public services are in general less accessible. But then we have also issues that around how programs for education, for health, for vocational training, access to skills, how these programs are shaped and designed. Indigenous peoples have their own cultures and ways of life that are often fundamentally different of mainstream society in a country, and there might be issues as simple as that these programs are not made available in the language these people speak. So there is many issues around promoting intercultural approaches to open these programs more, but also to have indigenous peoples themselves, through their institutions and representatives, participate in the design of the programs that are meant to reach them in order to make them pertinent and also integrate their ways of lives and their priorities. So this is really something that's also reflected in our convention, and this is something that more and more countries look into. How are public policies actually reaching those that are meant for? And indigenous and tribal peoples all over the world belong still to those that are having less access to public policies and services.
Thank you. If you're joining us now, we're speaking to Martin Alt, the ILO Senior Specialist on Equality and Non-Discrimination and our expert on the issue of indigenous people's rights. Martin, let's talk about climate change. This is, as we all know, one of the mega trends having an impact on the world of work. How does climate change impact, specifically speaking, indigenous and tribal peoples, and what can these people do to help tackle this issue?
That's actually a very interesting question, and it shows also that this agenda of inclusion is not only one of respect for diversity and human rights and fighting poverty, but it means it's also about actually reaching out to indigenous peoples as partners and allies in fighting climate change. Indigenous peoples live in areas where climate change is most noticeable. They live in the forests, they live in the Nordic where the ice is melting, so they're more affected by climate change, and this has changed their ways of life. These peoples have lived since time immemorial in in tune with nature, and so the way they have been living their traditional practices and livelihood activities are directly impacted, and this can have really serious consequences. And on the one hand, we need to address also their changing situations together with them, so to ensure that they have access to livelihoods also in the future. On the other hand, what they're doing in terms of traditional occupation is also could be part and can be part of comprehensive strategies for environmental protection, for actually protecting the forests, that's what they have been doing over so many years. So there is really a win-win in there. On the one hand, we need to see how they're affected and assist them in their fight against the effects of climate change, but on the other hand, we can reach out to indigenous peoples and really make them part of our strategies to adapt and to mitigate and to take effective climate action.
Thanks, Martin. That was actually a question that came through Twitter, and we have another one from Twitter. It says, how adapting skills training for indigenous peoples in the context of the future of work? How are we adapting skills training for indigenous peoples in the context of the future of work?
Oh, thanks for that question. Indigenous peoples have actually traditional knowledge about nature, about livelihoods, their traditional the work that they're being carrying out at the community level is based on traditional knowledge, and much of that is very important, and we can see it as a skill also in adapting to climate change. We can learn from that. Indigenous peoples are increasingly actually combining their traditional skills with using modern technologies actually to capture changes that are happening and to also to generate income, to develop new income generating activities. So there is a great deal of potential of learning for exchanging, but also on the other hand equipping them with some skills that may be needed also to transition to the formal economy, to make use of what the assets they have, and so there is really it's a great discussion to have, and this has to do also with the ILO's agenda and just transition. No? That is a how-to agenda. You know, it is. We know we need to respect rights of workers, of groups like indigenous peoples. We need to have a transition towards more different types of economic activities, and so indigenous peoples are really can be a part of that. And so the way we develop, document and disseminate skills to equip workers for these changes, I think indigenous peoples can be a part of that, and they should be a part of that, and we are well equipped with our constituents, our social justice agenda, and also with our just transition agenda that is really also very linked to social justice.
Martin, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Martin Eltz, Senior Specialist on Equality and Non-Discrimination from the ILO. If you want to know more about our work on indigenous and tribal peoples, please go to the ILO website. Under the theme Indigenous Peoples, you'll see that there's a lot of information there. Salwa?
Yes, in 1919, 100 years ago, the ILO was founded on the principle that universal and lasting peace can only be established if it's based upon social justice. This short video we're about to see next does take a look at the significance of those founding words.
Whereas universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based upon social justice.
Considerando que existen condiciones de trabajo que entrañan tal grado de injusticia, miseria y privaciones para gran número de seres humanos.
以致产生如此巨大的动荡，使世界和平与和谐遭受危害。
Принимая во внимание срочную необходимость улучшения этих условий.
Par exemple, en ce qui concerne la réglementation des heures de travail, la fixation d'une durée maximum de la journée et de la semaine de travail,
Regelung des Arbeitsmarktes, Verhütung der Arbeitslosigkeit,
وتوفير أجر يكفل ظروف معيشة مناسبة.
Protección del trabajador contra las enfermedades, sean o no profesionales, y contra los accidentes de trabajo.
La protection des enfants, des adolescents et des femmes
пенсий по старости и инвалидности.
Protection of the interests of workers when employed in countries other than their own.
Anerkennung des Grundsatzes gleicher Lohn für gleichwertige Arbeit.
承认结社自由的原则。
Organización de la enseñanza profesional y técnica y otras medidas análogas.
Attendu que la non-adoption par une nation quelconque d'un régime de travail réellement humain
is an obstacle in the way of other nations which desire to improve the conditions in their own countries.
فإن الأطراف السامية المتعاقدة تقرر مدفوعة بمشاعر العدالة والإنسانية.
А также желанием обеспечить прочный мир во всем мире.
并为实现本序言所提出的各项目标
Agreed to the following constitution of the International Labour Organization.
The ILO has a constitutional responsibility to build a future of work which corresponds to our mandated goals of social justice. We have 100 years of experience in making our world a fairer, safer place to work and a better place to live.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that short video on social justice. Now we're going to bring you the second of our dispatches from the forum that took place yesterday afternoon here, which focused on business for decent work. Two of our correspondents spoke to two panelists who took part in that discussion. The first one is Mr. Gustavo de Hoyos Walter, Presidente Nacional de la Confederación Patronal de la República Mexicana, and the second one is Ms. Olajumoke Adekeye, Youth Representative and founder of the Young Business Agency.
Desde la conferencia del centenario de la OIT, donde acaba de concluir una sesión especial de debate sobre el tema de empresas, trabajo decente, muy influida por los desafíos del futuro del trabajo, conversamos ahora con el señor Gustavo de Hoyos Walter, quien es presidente de la Confederación Patronal de la República Mexicana, más conocida como Coparmex. Quisiera saber cuál fue su principal mensaje al debate.
Sobre todo, reflexionamos que si queremos que haya trabajos dignos, suficientes en el futuro, tenemos que volver a pensar cómo asegurarnos que existan empresas fuertes que puedan cubrir esas expectativas de remuneración, de prestaciones y sobre todo de empleos suficientes de cara al futuro. Una reflexión que no tome en cuenta la necesidad de contar con suficientes empresas y que esas empresas sean fuertes es una reflexión incompleta, porque es bien sabido que la mayor parte, la inmensa mayoría de los trabajos en el mundo entero lo generan las empresas privadas, de tal manera que un entorno global en el cual queramos aspirar a esta realidad requiere necesariamente pensar en las empresas.
Usted se refirió en particular a la situación de las pequeñas, medianas empresas y el gran desafío que se plantea en este caso. ¿Qué nos podría comentar al respecto?
Bueno, yo señalé que a veces se habla de un trabajo que sea digno, que sea permanente, que cuente con muchas prestaciones y a veces cuando se está discutiendo estos temas se piensa en la gran empresa multinacional, en el conglomerado nacional que tiene decenas de miles de personas. Sin embargo, la gran mayoría de los trabajos en el mundo hoy se crean en pequeñas empresas, en microempresas. Así es que tenemos que encontrar los mecanismos para que estas aspiraciones legítimas de tener trabajos dignos, permanentes, bien remunerados, tengan también una contrapartida en la forma en que se apoye a las microempresas para que puedan precisamente generar ese tipo de trabajos.
Otro tema que se conversó durante este debate tuvo que ver con la capacitación que es necesario realizar, sobre todo para los jóvenes, con vistas a los desafíos del futuro del trabajo. Y tuve la oportunidad de estar ahí cuando usted comentaba este tema. ¿Por qué no nos comenta sobre este desafío?
Sí, tenemos que pasar de una visión de corto plazo, de capacitación, de entregar aptitudes para el corto plazo a una visión de formación para la vida. La nueva realidad de la automatización del conocimiento hace que el conocimiento adquirido en el nivel técnico, en el nivel profesional, va a ser insuficiente en largo plazo, de tal manera que hoy tendremos sí que dar opciones de capacitación para lo inmediato, para ingresar a las posiciones de trabajo, pero será igual o mucho más importante cómo en el curso de la relación laboral vamos dando esta formación que permita afrontar y reinventarse cada trabajador para dentro de 10 y dentro de 20 años. Es decir, la formación, por buena que haya sido en un principio de la vida laboral, hoy va a ser insuficiente para mantenerse competitivo y con un buen trabajo.
Le agradecemos mucho haber compartido estas opiniones.
Muchas gracias.
Hello, I'm here with Jumoke Adekeye from the Young Business Agency. We just finished the session on business for a decent work, and we are very much interested in knowing the main messages you have convened to the forum.
Basically is that private sector have an opportunity to invest in invest in upskilling youth that are already in employment, but also in investing in entrepreneurs and investing in high growth entrepreneurship opportunities to create jobs. And so that we have the large demographic dividend actually that will come out of creating more jobs and having inclusive growth in various economies around the world.
Okay. Could maybe also explain us which are the main, I would say, like objectives and work that the agency you're working for, and you have been one of the founders, is doing?
Absolutely, and so we do two things. One primarily is to help young people get jobs. We provide an employability skills curriculum that young people go through and are also matched with employers once they go through this program. The essence is to recognize that the young people who may not have had access to employability skills training don't know how to prepare a job application or interview or understand commercial awareness, among other workplace competencies, and so we provide that to young people. We're also very much interested in connecting young entrepreneurs, budding entrepreneurs, to business mentors. Really, we want to see it, and this is also one of the key messages that I was sharing today for private sector and also public sector, to create business ecosystems that enable young entrepreneurs with ideas to grow and also identify high growth and high value sectors where they can thrive in business.
You were mentioning the importance of creating business ecosystems. Could you explain us a bit more what it means that, and which has to be the role of the private and the public in constructing these business ecosystems?
Absolutely. I think there are many roles that both public-private partners, both public and the private sectors can play. One important area for private sector is providing access to their businesses, their business models, in terms of the general ideas. One thing that in the area that I come from, the demographic I represent, Sub-Saharan Africa, we find that we're often told management is weak in terms of business knowledge and know-how, and so we see global organizations, large organizations, as able to help mentor young people who are interested in business, to provide access to markets, and also really to help expose them to new ideas, new techniques, and bring them to a level of excellence that really can help them scale their ideas and businesses. Public sector is important in setting policies and funding objectives, creating incentives for businesses to want to invest in young people, and ensuring that these investments are not just short-term, not just for the medium term, but for the long term. So helping to develop vision for youth-centric policies, youth-centric business ideas or business ecosystem frameworks that really help us ensure that we have the youth agenda firmly in our economies and how we think about inclusive growth.
Thank you very much for sharing with us this very inspiring initiative and for the work and commitment with the youth.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
As we mentioned earlier, the thematic forums of this International Labour Conference came to a close yesterday. There were 7 of them, actors from the world of work getting together and discussing vital issues relating to the world of work. a lot of work went into preparing for and producing these events. And now Fernanda Dutra went backstage to get a behind-the-scenes look at some of the preparations that went into preparing for these events.
We are at a moment where we are seeing a convergence of multiple crises in a very concentrated time.
Unions have to change themselves.
Because when you talk about inequalities,
d'abord la coopération. Ensuite, la coordination de leurs politiques.
Women's rights and gender equality are key to this work. For a sustainable transition and just future of work, women need to be fully empowered.
Seeing in terms of how organizations are responding to lifelong learning.
We always think of refugees and work here in Europe, in North America. No, 85% of refugees, displaced, stateless people are in poor countries, middle-income countries.
So to my friend at the ILO, happy centennial and congratulations, because for 100 years you have served the noble cause of social partnership and social justice.
This one does nice. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
And I must congratulate you. Say that I'm very happy to see that everything is in place. I know that it was not very easy.
On the future of work, we will have high-level panelists, heads of agencies, leaders from business, leaders from employers' organizations, workers' organizations, and the academia coming together to debate various issues on the future of work. These thematic sessions take place outside of the standing orders of the international conference.
We are two coordinators actually looking at the overall coordination of the thematic forums. My role was being primarily responsible for the first and second sessions, and that those are on child labour and on freedom of association and collective bargaining.
Moi je me suis occupée de tout ce qui est logistique, administratif. Donc ça joue en effet les réservations d'hôtels, les lettres d'invitation, faire en sorte que tout le matériel arrive à temps. Le protocole, le programme, et heureusement on a des collègues très très chouettes au BIT. On a appelé en urgence n'importe qui, et n'importe qui était là pour nous aider au dernier moment. Là, voilà. Donc ici c'est celle donc l'arrivée de nos panélistes. Il y a un salon ici Jura qu'on va encore aménager.
Madame.
The G20 in China.
7 languages.
You prepared me.
Working conditions and
Le modérateur de chaque session va expliquer aux panélistes exactement comment les sessions vont se dérouler. Ici, on aura un petit coin avec le café, thé et le croissant pour les arrivées.
So I was asked if I could give my inputs into how the panel could be organized, what types of questions could be asked, talking to the moderator, developing questions with her for the panelists and the speakers, and just basically giving assistance to the Secretariat. He will present the thematic forum. Then it will be handed over to Ms. Imogen Fuchs.
We have two panelists. Mr. Zhu will be speaking in Chinese, and there will be interpretation when he speaks.
Donc après, nous, on va les accompagner. Ou à gauche, ou à droite, suivant à quel côté ils sont assis. Et puis, quand le moment est venu, on retourne au podium. Et on vient par là. Donc on revient par là. Normalement, la salle va être remplie. Et là, on voit notre jolie scène pour les thématiques.
We had rehearsals here. It's been a lot of work and a lot of people working behind the scenes. Throughout the whole of last week, we had rehearsals in this room where the with the coordinators of the technical coordinators of each of the different themes. We're in here, we ran through everything that they had to do. We're learning a lot, everything from protocol issues to where they've got to be, to lighting, to sound, to the content as well.
We've had full rooms so far. I think the support that we've had from the communications department has been really great, and we hope that the final 3 sessions that we have today on technology, tomorrow morning on multilateralism, and in the afternoon on business for decent work will be as successful as last week.
Thank you, and please join me in thanking this incredible panel. Thank you.
Welcome back. That was our colleague Fernanda Dutra, who's doing a nice backstage video showing what it's like to put together the thematic forums that took place this week at the ILC. Now, in an interview that we did earlier with Patrick Belzer on the issue of income inequality, we saw that the gender pay gap is one of the big issues that the ILO is seeking to help address. We're going to be talking more about gender equality and the gender pay gap in a few minutes' time. Salwa has gone upstairs to meet the ILO senior expert on this issue, so we'll be bringing you that interview live in a few minutes. If you have any questions on the issue of gender equality, please do send them now, tagging ILO 100 or OIT 100. Now, one of the examples of the international effort to tackle the issue of gender pay gap is the Equal Pay International Coalition, which the ILO is a part of. Here's a short video to tell you more about this coalition.
Gender pay gaps stubbornly persist. At present, across the world, women earn around 20% less than men on average per month.
One of the most effective ways to reduce the gender pay gap is to promote equal pay for work of equal value, as provided for under the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically 5 and 8.5 of the 2030 Agenda.
Reducing the gender pay gap is not impossible.
All over the world, countries, companies and workers are pioneering new and innovative solutions.
Legislation providing the right to equal pay for work of equal value.
Requiring companies to publish their gender pay gap data publicly.
There are free online pay calculators and other tools which determine the portion of discrimination of the gender pay gap.
Companies that apply equal pay can be certified.
Minimum wage policies and collective bargaining agreements that include equal pay clauses.
What is clear is that no one-size solution can fit all, and that no single actor can solve the challenge of equal pay alone.
The Equal Pay International Coalition, EPIC, is a collective effort to accelerate progress in closing the gender pay gap by 2030.
Governments, companies, civil society, academia, employers and workers' organizations can join and contribute to making a change.
EPIC provides a platform for peer-to-peer exchanges, knowledge sharing of data and tools. It encourages countries to adopt progressive policies towards gender equality, thus reducing the pay gap.
Bring your expertise, knowledge, commitment, and make a change towards societies that value women and men's work equally.
Learn more about EPIC and sign up to be part of the solution.
That video that we just saw was on Equal Pay International Coalition, and maybe our next speaker can tell us a little bit more about that in a bit. With me now is Emanuela Pozzan, ILO Senior Specialist on Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination. Emanuela, thank you very much for joining us. In 1919, 100 years ago, the ILO adopted the first convention on women and work. A century later now, and women are indeed a force in the labor market, but gender gaps have not significantly narrowed for the past 20 years. What's holding women back?
Thank you, Salwa, for this question.
I think it's great that 100 years ago we actually had one of the first conventions of the ILO relating to gender equality. And it was in fact looking at maternity protection. And after that convention, many more followed that are particularly interesting in the promotion of equal opportunities and equal treatment for women and men in the world of work. But as you rightly said, unfortunately, even if we have had important progress on having women joining and participating in the labor force, we still have major gaps as well in the world of work in particular. And so even if we know for a fact, because we have research, that women want to work, 70% of the female population want to be in the world of work. And also men agree with this, but yet we see that numbers are not really following this wish of women. And in fact, what we see is that we have 4 out of 10 women that are actually working compared to 7 out of 10 men. So the gap is still very important and very wide. Now, what is holding women back? Well, I think we also need to look at history. The truth is that the world of work has been shaped in a way by men for men, and that women had to find their own way into this world of work shaped by men for men. And so even if there has been progress in making sure that the world of work is reshaped to, ensure that also women, ensure that also the world of work is also for women and that also women can shape it, we're still not there yet. And there are a lot of factors that contribute to this. And I'm sure that we can discuss this.
We will. Yes, indeed we will. But first, let's also look at one other phenomenon. Women face what's termed a motherhood employment penalty. And surprisingly, between 2005 and 2015, this disadvantage, in fact, increased significantly by 38%. Can you tell us first what this means and why it happens, do you think?
Yeah, in fact, going back to what I was saying before, when we look at the gender gap in the world of work, one aspect that particularly penalizes women to enter the world of work and re-enter and progress in the world of work is motherhood. And the motherhood employment gap is actually the gap between women with children and women without children progressing in the world of work, in being in employment and having a career. And unfortunately, we see, as you rightly said, that this gap is expanding, is enlarging, but we also know that there are solutions, very effective solutions to close the motherhood employment gap. And the motherhood employment gap is also very much related to the motherhood wage gap. So basically being a woman in the world of work and having children comes with less opportunities to be in the world of work. It comes with lower wages, and it also comes with lower possibilities of progressing in the world of work. Yet, as I said, there are solutions, and in fact those countries that are looking into very concretely into policies and measures to promote family care policies and long-term care policies, these countries are advancing in reducing the motherhood employment penalty.
Now, the ILO's Global Commission on the Future of Work report calls for a transformative and measurable agenda for gender equality. Tell us first what that means in terms of policies and actions that we need.
Yes, as I mentioned, what we need is the future of work needs to be embedded into a concept of a common project. The world of work needs to become a common project. It has to be shaped by women and men. We have to make sure that new forms of work or new technologies actually do not perpetuate some of those stereotypes that have been ingrained in societies and that have been embedded in the world of work. So what is needed and what is meant by transformative agenda is really looking at a world of work that welcomes the fact that there is work and there is care, and that care is work. And therefore a world of work needs to provide policies and measures that support care. We need time to care. We need time to make sure that we are successful in our jobs, but that also we are successful in our lives within our commitments, also to make sure that our families are cared for. And it's very important that we conceive a world of work that takes all of this into consideration. So we need to stop having a distinction between work and care needs to be redistributed between women and men, certainly, but also between families and the state.
Thank you, Emanuela. As you saw the last week, we had a number of heads of state, and we have more heads of state as well in government this week. But many of them brought up the issue that gender equality is one of the main issues to be solved in the world of work. How do you see this reflected in actions on the national level?
It's always great to see heads of states saying clearly and stating very passionately as well that gender equality is a priority. And however, sometimes we need to make sure that a lot of the statements translate into reality and that is not just cosmetics. And we also need to make sure that those countries that are particularly advanced and progressive, they extend the hand to other countries to make sure that gender equality becomes a priority. We have the solutions. We know what can be done to close the gender gap. We have plenty of research. We have plenty of good practices from all over the world. It's really a matter of willingness, commitment, and believing that inequality, that believe in equality.
Emanuela, we don't have that much time left, but there is something else that we want, if you can comment on very briefly. Equal pay for work of equal value is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. What progress has been made to achieve this? And is it still possible to achieve gender equality in the world of work by 2030?
Well, in fact, equal pay for work of equal value is a very important right of women and men to be paid equally, also for work of equal value. We have a sustainable development goal that is dedicated, SDG 8.5, a target that is dedicated to equal pay for work of equal value, because we need to accelerate progress in this area. This is an area where not much progress has happened during the past decades, and it is extremely important that we do more. And for this reason, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, together with UN Women and the OECD, is promoting what we call the Equal Pay International Coalition, EPIC. It's important for countries, for companies, for trade unions, for NGOs to come together and really create a critical mass to promote, to make sure that the right of equal pay for work of equal right is realized.
Emanuela Pozzan, ILO Senior Specialist on Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination. Thank you very much for joining us. And now it's back to you, Martin.
Thank you, Salwa. Thank you, Emanuela. Now, as we heard earlier in the show, indigenous peoples make up 5% of the world's population, but they also make up 15% of the world's poor. As a result of discrimination and exclusion, indigenous women are often amongst the poorest of the poor. In the next video, we want to show you an ILO project that is taking place in Bolivia. It's about the way the ILO is working with its social partners to empower indigenous women and to help them attain social justice. Let's take a look.
Bolivia, and especially the capital city of La Paz, is undergoing a building boom. And with an increased demand for labor, many of the workers new to the construction industry are women, especially indigenous women from Bolivia's countryside. They arrive in La Paz with a desire to work, but with limited knowledge of their rights, and they are vulnerable to abuse and discrimination. Annalise Melendez works for a local organization helping indigenous women in the construction sector.
Obviously, for women who come from a rural area to live in a city, discrimination becomes more complex. It is not only because she is a woman, but also because she is indigenous and because of her level of education.
In Bolivia, the ILO works with trade unions, local government, and employers to increase awareness about the rights for indigenous women and also provide training in occupational safety on the construction site. Natividad Velasco is one of the indigenous women who received the training.
La seguridad es muy importante en el trabajo. ¿Por qué?
Safety is very important at work. There used to be a lot of accidents. Now that we've had the safety courses, we know what safety is, and we take care of each other.
Perceptions are beginning to change. There's a trade union specifically for women who work in Bolivia's construction sector.
10 years ago, you could rarely see a woman in a construction work, maybe one or two. Comparing the number now, there are more.
The trade union has energized local government and employers to help ensure indigenous women have a voice in policies that affect them.
Vemos con buenos ojos de que la
We gladly see that more women are involved in these associations, and it is evolving in a favourable way. Their voice is being listened and included in different policies, programs and projects, not only nationally, but especially locally.
I think the representation, union or federation makes women feel more protected. Because of the representation, and also because they can negotiate with the employer and manage the work hours, wages and the rights they have.
The ILO also provides business and entrepreneurship skills training for indigenous women, a virtual platform of women construction workers in Bolivia who have been trained and certified by training centers helps them enter the job market.
Why do women get in this labor market? Because incomes are better than in other sectors in Bolivia. We are on that path. We hope to achieve this in the short term, and there is willpower among all the actors involved, so I think we're moving in the right direction.
Indigenous women like Natividad still face many challenges, but providing skills and making them more aware of their rights helps ensure they won't be left behind in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. In Bolivia, indigenous women increasingly have a voice. Empowering them is making a difference in their lives.
I want to tell my partners who are women and have suffered like me, when they still feel that discrimination, I want them to keep going, and I don't want them to fade. They have to get ahead. They have to be a rock that cannot bend.
Now, measuring labor market indicators helps inform policymakers, helps them make their decisions, and it addresses issues such as inequality that we've been discussing today. Before the conference, Adam Bowers spoke with the ILO's chief statistician, Rafael Diaz de Medina, about the importance of good data and about how we're going to measure the future of work.
Strong labour statistics are needed to make strong policy choice, and I'm joined today by the ILO's Chief Statistician and Director of the ILO Statistics Department, Rafael Diaz de Medina. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. We're here to discuss labour statistics today. Now, the world of work is changing fast, and with it, I guess, the way in which you're collecting statistics. Could you tell us a bit more?
Well, yes, the labour statisticians are catching up and trying to meet the challenges of the new forms of work that are emerging and also the changing labor markets. So statisticians want to capture quickly the new phenomena in the labor markets, and the ILO is also partnering with them, with all the constituents who are and the labor statistician all over the world.
So there's new forms of work emerging, the platform economy and so on. How do we measure labour statistics in those environments?
Well, this is a challenging thing. Of course, the ILO has been hosting a lot of hectic debates on this subject, particularly on how to capture these emerging new forms. We have the platform workers, we have the gig economy, the unpaid work, the dependent contractors, all these new forms that probably in the recent past, they were not present, and we are trying to capture. How do you do that? Well, of course, we have to revisit all the old ways of the old classifications that we used to have, and the countries have to start adapting them. It's a long process, but we are shortening it because of the urgency of the policymakers to get new data and accurate data, because otherwise we will be all blind with these new forms of work. So it's a very hectic process we have been doing with the International Conference of Labour Statisticians, but also in other fora and with many partners on that.
And in terms of the big picture, the way we measure economic growth and development, I mean, how reliable is that? Can we actually measure it fully? I mean, GDP is obviously one that's used to measure economic growth, but how is it actually a picture of development fully?
Well, GDP has been recently challenged from many sides. We have the Stiglitz Commission that the ILO has launched jointly with the French government some years ago. But we have many academic and very active discussions on how to capture these new forms. But the most important thing is that for the ILO, even in 1969, when the ILO received the Nobel Prize, the DG David Morse also already highlighted in those times the need to incorporate well-being and the employment dimension in GDP. Clearly is insufficient, and it has been increasingly accepted that, and we are working actively. We have to include things like unpaid work, the role of women in the world of work, the sustainable part that is absent, the role of volunteer work, all these new emerging forms. They are really poorly captured, and for sure the well-being of the people are not captured. So there is a distance, a gap between the GDP measures and the feelings of the people. And we are seeing and watching what are the consequences in the world today.
And you spoke there about a measure of well-being. The Global Commission on the Future of Work this year launched its report with recommendations really calling for a human-centred future of work. How does one measure a human-centred future of work?
Well, this is quite a good question, and I think that, well, precisely the Global Commission focuses its attention partly on the limitations of GDP and the beyond GDP discussions. And I think, of course, the human-centered, it means to capture well the well-being. And for that, we have a different metrics that are possible and liable now to put in place. There is an effort, of course, for countries to agree to incorporate this. OECD has launched an agenda on well-being measurement. We are part of it. We are partners on that in the labor components and the social protection components. And of course, we are also bringing the tripartite constituents in the discussions.
And in terms of development broadly, we have the Sustainable Development Goals working towards 2030 with a broad agenda looking at 17 goals and many targets. And obviously these targets need to be measured as we move towards 2030. How is the ILO involved in that measurement?
Well, the ILO has been really at the center of many of the consolidation of the global indicator framework. We are custodian agency for 14 indicators in the agenda, and we are part of another 30. So in total, we manage a lot of indicators related to decent work. So it's not only on employment, but social protection, rights, and social dialogue. And in this, our role is we consolidate the capacities, the national capacities of countries to report this data. It's a country-driven process, so we have to strengthen the capacities of the countries and also promote trainings, manuals. We have just launched a manual on SDG indicators to facilitate this process. And we actively report globally the progress of the SDGs, particularly centered in Goal 8, which is decent work, but also in other goals.
Great, thank you. And last year you brought colleagues together, workers, employers and governments together in an international conference of labour statisticians here at the ILO. Could you tell us a little bit more about how that went, the conclusions perhaps, and what were the real innovations that came out of the conference?
Well, this was the best attended, I would say the very best attended conference since 1923, that it was the first one. So we are also about to be the centenary of the ICLS as well. And there was participation of more than 400 delegates from 140 countries. So we are very happy of the outcomes. It was a very innovative ICLS, and for sure we tried to link this with the centenary challenges that we have in the ILO. So the main resolutions were focused precisely on the non-standard forms of work. It was a resolution on work relationships, so we dealt with the dependent contractors, the platform economy, and of course hinting at new forms of informality as well. So it was a very rich discussion. This was the core, but also we had some resolutions on the SDG indicators on labor rights, that it will be the first time that we have that, so also on youth employment programs. And also we had revisiting the measurement on how we measure child labor. And we released it was adopted four guidelines. One on labor migration, very topical issue now. We have on forced labor, also very linked with vulnerabilities. And we launched guidelines on cooperatives. And finally, we also launched guidelines on how to measure skills mismatch.
So given the way that the world is changing, the labour markets are changing, you're constantly having to innovate.
Yes, for sure. Even not only ourselves, but also helping the countries to do that, and particularly how to deal with new forms of capturing data, for instance. Now it's emerging, the big data debate, the possibility to have more data from administrative records in real time. It's still very incipient in the labor statistics. It's not as in other areas, but we have benefited, of course, of the geospatial information, the satellite information, in mobile data, things that we could capture, and really we also benefited on supporting the countries how to capture the information quicker, because the problem now, everybody wants to have the data now, for yesterday, not for tomorrow. So the problem is to catch up with that, and I think there are many new forms that we are doing, like CAPI, which is the computer-assisted personal interview. That is something that now the service on the labor force service in the world are done in the field, and they are captured immediately. It's not that they have to pass through long periods, and we are facilitating this process.
And of course, the ILO's constituents, governments, workers, employers, rely on the ILO for labour data, labour market data. What are their priorities? What are their biggest needs when they come to us?
Well, their priority is to have sound labour market information systems for them to guide themselves, their policies. They don't want to be blind, and the blinder they are, the worse they develop their own policies. So I think their priorities, of course, is to coordinate their own systems. The first thing is to produce the data in a sustainable way, in an update way, because it has to be catching up with these new forms and new definitions and new ways of capturing data, and then of course disseminate it and use it. And so they rely on the ILO to help them in the training, in the new concepts, in hosting this, because we really host the discussions. The discussion actually is done by our constituents. Workers, employers and governments, they meet together and they discuss actively their own thing. So their priorities are is to capture new ways and also to get more data. Of course, they have limitations in their budgets, and we are living with that. But I think now increasingly the wealth of information is being acknowledged, and it's very clear, because in our governing body, in our discussion in ILC, it's clear that the countries have outvoiced their support to statistics and to have proper statistics, and they call on the office to provide them this support.
Rafael Diaz de Medina, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
That was Adam Bowers speaking to the ILO's chief statistician, Rafael Diaz de Medina, about the importance of good data and about measuring the future of work. Martin, I think we're nearing the end of another Daily Show.
Yes, this is the end. It's another edition of the Daily Show. If you're just joining now and you missed the full 2 hours, don't worry, you can watch it again. It'll be available on this same website, ilo.org, in a few minutes. Looking forward to this afternoon. We have 3 high-level visits. We have the Prime Minister of Portugal, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and the Vice President of Costa Rica. Tomorrow, we have the visit of the President of the Marshall Islands and also the visit of King Philip of Belgium. The committees will start wrapping up their work tomorrow, and in the afternoon we will have a panel of our current Director General, Guy Ryder, who will be talking to 2 former Director Generals, Juan Somavia and Michel Ansen, and they'll be joined by the former chairs of our governing body, Sir Roy Trotman and Daniel Funes de Roja. So all that will be available on the ILO website. It'll be live. So please make sure to tune in. The high-level section in this afternoon starts in about an hour's time, so 3:45 Geneva time. Please make sure to tune in and watch that live. And if you have any questions, any comments, please do send them to us. The hashtag is ILO100, OIT100 in French and Spanish. So that's it for today. Sawa, thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.